again. Welcome back to Wickham Cottage and the Block Afghan project. Today we are going to expand our knowledge. We're going to take the ribbings that we did and explore new ways to use them. Now, if you'll notice, this cuff uses the double rib that we learned with the garter stitch. And this pattern, one of my favorites, is known as moss stitch. If you can kind of cover everything up, you'll see that basically it is knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one. You work that for 2 rows, and then you move it over a stitch, and you work the knits over the pearls and the pearls over the knits for 2 rows. So this moss stitch is a 4-row repeat. What we've learned so far is a 1-row repeat, such as the garter stitch, or a 2-row, such as stockinette stitch, and some of the ribbings. But today we're going 4 rows. And what I like to suggest when you're working 4 rows, you write down a pattern. Now we'll have this in pattern form eventually, and you can maybe print that off. But I like to keep a pattern. And what some people like to do to keep track of what they're working on, they put a Post-it. Post-its can unstick over time. So now we've got this neat washi tape. So we can put a washi tape, either covering up what we're not going to do, or maybe pointing to the row that we are going to do. Again, that loses stick over time. And, you just get a new piece. But a little annoying. So what I like to use is this metallic board. You can pop your pattern on there, and you can use these magnetic pieces to block off what you're doing. Keep moving it. Sometimes you can find those black strips. What I've got here is one that not only gives you a nice magnet, it's not going to move. These measurements, just ignore, those are for counted cross stitch. But here we have inch measurement up to 7 inches, which is really convenient for us because we're working 7-inch blocks. So this can keep track of your rows that you're knitting, and it can also be your measuring guide so that everything is consistent. Now here I've written out a pattern. I want to just introduce you very quickly to pattern writing. And you'll see it says row 1, RS means right side or public side. Sometimes you start on a wrong side row. So sometimes it'll say row 1, wrong side with a W. But we're starting on the right side. So we're going to knit 2 stitches. Then we're going to do our repeat. Purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 2. It says repeat between the asterisks or the stars to the end of the row. Sometimes you'll see a parentheses. Sometimes you'll see a bracket. Sometimes it'll only have a star at the beginning, and it'll say repeat from star to end of row. You'll see them in various ways. And then the next row you come to, it just says row 2. We know row 2 is a wrong side row because we know row 1 is a right side row. But what I like to do, we know what we're doing. So in the effort of time, if you're writing this on an index card or just you might write this on a Post-it. You can write purl 2, knit 2, purl 2 between those, and you know that you're starting with a purl 2 and then you're repeating to the end of the row. We know that. We don't have to have that spelled out for us. So that might be handy for you. And then I've got down here, repeat rows 1 through 4 for pattern. Now I'm just showing you that because sometimes you'll have an introductory row. or a setup row. So sometimes you'll work 2 or 3 or 4 rows, but then when you're doing the repeat, you're going to go from row 4 or row 5. So it'll say repeat from row 5 to 12 for pattern. Sometimes those will be foundation rows and they won't even be numbered. So the repeat will still be repeat rows 1 through 10, even though you had 2 more rows down before. I hope that makes sense. When you get more advanced, you're probably going to start reading from charts. Charts are a really handy way to see knitting depicted in chart form. It's much easier for me to follow anyway, and a lot of people, but at this point, the written word is still the best. It's easy. So there are some various ways of marking your pattern so that you know which row you're on. What I like to do, you've also got little row counters that you can use or clicky things that you can use. I like to complete the row. And then I move the magnet down, or I click that row counter. When the row is done, I change. Because if you sometimes change it at the beginning of the row, you've just sat down, you're going to knit row 1, so you move that marker, you're going to get confused as to whether you've done it at the beginning or the end. So choose one method and stick to it forever. I like to do it when it's complete because you never know when the doorbell is going to ring, the phone is going to ring, you'll get interrupted. So it's always a good idea to complete it and then mark it off. So let's learn some of these. I'm going to move the camera down so that we can see what we're knitting. But yeah, this sweater is so fun. It's so vibrant. I usually don't wear bright colors, but sometimes, in the years when I was designing for magazines, say I would design this in a blue, they would say, no, we want raspberry, we want pink, we want orange. And they'd send you yarn that you otherwise wouldn't use. And it turns out to be fun. So when you're choosing colors for something like an Afghan, go out of your comfort level if you want to. I'm using some very pastel shades of green and blue and lavender. But wouldn't it be fun? Say you've learned the garter stitch. You're comfortable with garter stitch. You just want to knit for the piece of it all. You don't want to learn a whole lot. You just want to stick with your garter stitch for a while. You can make blocks, such as we're knitting right now. You can make blocks in garter stitch in dozens of different colors. And then you can sew those all together. So you can have a diversity of pattern or color. Either is fine, whichever makes you happy, whichever the recipient of the Afghan would like. Or if you're trying to use up old yarn that you've had stored for a long, long time, just do lots of blocks. Like I say, if you sew them together, you've got a great Afghan. If you don't want to sew them together, you can send them off and donate them. So hang on just for a second and then we'll get some knitting. All right, so our first pattern is going to be this lovely densely knit fabric known as seed stitch. They look like little seeds, don't they? Now, do you remember when I was showing you garter stitch and stockinette stitch, and I explained that the row gauges were vastly different? This is another one. It takes a lot of rows to make seed stitch. So it goes a little bit slower than some of the other stitches because you're alternating a knit with a purl. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. Just like we've done before on the ribbing. But then when we go to the other side, instead of lining everything up, we're alternating. So before we were knitting the knits and purling the purls as they faced us. Now we want to do the opposite. When we see a knit, we want to put a purl over it. And we'll come out with this nice pattern. Now this is, like I say, this is just like ribbing. It's a 2-row repeat. The only difference is you're not stacking knits upon knits, you're alternating them. And you come out with this nice seed stitch. This is a fun one. And this is used quite frequently in edgings as well. So you could have a cuff made out of seed stitch, and that would be lovely. It would really hold in your garment because of its density. Now, this is our first 4-row pattern. This is called moss stitch, and that's what this sweater is made out of. Well, I don't know if I can get a good view of it, but this is moss stitch, and in its most basic forms, it's the same as seed stitch, but instead of working one row over and then another row back alternating, we're working 2 rows in rib and then another 2 rows in rib, but alternating the placement. I hope that makes sense. So we've got a rib going there. We've got a knit with a knit over it, and then a purl with a purl over it, and then another knit with a knit over it. So it's basically, you've got a single rib. If you alternate the stitches from row to row, you have seed stitch. If you elongate that into 4 rows and stack 2 like stitches over 2 unlike stitches, so to speak, then you end up with moss stitch. Now, another one of my favorite stitches, and I said that seed stitch was pretty dense. This is called box stitch, and this is quite loose. This is a 4-row repeat, but instead of knit 1 and purl 1, you're doing a double rib. So it's basically double rib on top of double rib in reverse. So let's knit a little bit on this one, just so you can see what is involved. Hang on, I'm going to lower my camera just a little bit, just so that maybe you can see better. So, to start out, I have 2 knit stitches. So according to my pattern, I want to start with a purl now. I want to purl, do another purl because this is the double rib portion. Now we've got 2 purls. So we want to put 2 knits over the purls. Then we go back to putting 2 purls over the 2 knits. Can you see the pattern emerging? I'm at a very, very awkward angle, and it makes knitting quite difficult. So if it looks like I'm struggling a little bit, you know, your assessment is correct. Ribbings are great. And at the edges of sweaters, they're fabulous. And sometimes you just want to keep up that nice relaxing flow. But you want more of a pattern, and you want it all over the sweater. And that's what some of these stitches are great for. The moss stitch and the box stitch in particular. They would make great scarves. They make great sweater patterns. And when you knit an Aran sweater, these are what are known as filler stitches. Sometimes you want nice flashy cables, but then to rest the eye, you'll do a filler stitch, which is a moss stitch, for example, or a seed stitch. Now we've completed our row, and you've got half the pattern going. We need to turn it over. And now, do you see there are knit stitches? This is the wrong side row. So what we want to do is keep that in ribbing form. We want to keep that going. So we're doing likes over likes. We've got pearls here, so we're doing pearls. I find this stitch lovely. Hand over it a little bit so that the light doesn't wash it out. So here are our blocks laid out. The seed stitch has been done. And you can see when it's laid out, you can see kind of a vertical, you can see 2, 2, 2, 2. So you can count the repeats actually. You can kind of see a line going down in between, which is kind of a neat thing. If we go over to our moss stitch, you can see them oriented more diagonally. And what that is doing is it's creating kind of a bias. A bias is a pull toward one corner. And for our blanket, it's going to be fine. You're going to have blocks on each side. It's going to hold it in shape. So the bias is not too concerning for us right now. If you were doing a scarf in this pattern, you might want to think about adding a little bit of garter to it along the edges just to keep its shape from biasing. And then down below here, we've got our moss stitch. I'm sorry, we've got our box stitch. And you can see, you know, they look like little boxes here. So we've got our 1 by 1 with a 2-row repeat. We've got our 1 by 1 with a 4-row repeat. And we've got our 2 by 2 with a 4-row repeat. So look at how far you've advanced just from learning the knit stitch and the purl stitch. There's so many things that can be done just by repeating those 2 stitches. These are really, really fun blocks, and I hope you'll give them a try. And I don't know if I've mentioned this earlier, but you don't have to limit yourself to just one swatch of each pattern. If you like these patterns, you can make them in different colors. You can repeat them. There's no reason why you couldn't do every other block in moss stitch. So have fun with them. You're going to find some blocks you prefer over others, either in the way they look or the way that it feels when you knit them. And if you like that block, you can sort of get a base going of maybe 6 or 8 blocks so that there's some continuity to your Afghan. That's always a fun thing to do too. I wanted to say one word before I leave you for today about binding off stitches. We learned to bind off and knit. We learned to bring our yarn forward, work purl stitches. We can bind off and purl. We can bind off and pattern. We can knit. When we did the ribbings, we would knit the knit stitch, purl the purl stitch, bring it over. What we're going to do now is bind off in pattern. And what that means is you simply just knit the row as you were going to knit the row. Usually you bind off on a last row or a first row, or, you know, we're doing a measurement. So we'll get our work to 9 inches and then we'll bind off whichever row we're on. It's nice to finish a repeat. So it's always good to work your last wrong side row. So for our case, it would be a bind off on a row 1 or a row 3. What you do is you work the first 2 stitches, just like usual, then bring 1 stitch over. Then you work the next stitch in the pattern that you would have knit were you not binding off. So basically, you're knitting the row, you're working the row, I should say. Knitting consists of knits and purls, so it gets confusing when you talk about knitting. Are you talking about the knit stitch? You're knitting a knit stitch, or are you knitting an entire sweater? It gets confusing. So I'll try to say work. So when you're working your piece, if you've got a knit stitch that you should be working next, knit it. You know, if it's supposed to be a purl stitch, purl it, and then work the bind off. So you're doing two things simultaneously. Now, if you don't want to do that, if it's not fun, if you say, oh my gosh, this is too much work, I can't remember where I'm supposed to be, bind off and knit. It's perfectly fine. Some people always bind off and knit. There's nothing wrong with that. This is your work. And when you're learning, it's fun to bind off in pattern, bind off and knit, bind off and purl. See what you think of each, what each gives you. They'll give you something slightly different. So explore. It's always fun to explore. These are easy blocks. We're just learning. See what feels good to you. See what looks good to you. And have fun with your knitting. Join me again. We'll learn something else that's fun. Have a good day, and I'll see you soon.